Upon my arrival at headquarters, Marshal Lannes warned me that he counted heavily on me, both because of what Augereau had told him about me, and for the way I had already served under him during the Friedland campaign. "If you are not killed," he said, "I will see that you advance very rapidly." The Marshal never promised in vain, and the high favor he enjoyed with the Emperor made everything possible for him. I therefore resolved to serve with the greatest courage and unflagging zeal. Leaving Bayonne, we marched with the troop columns to the Ebro, where we joined King Joseph and the young army that had fought the previous campaign. Rest and the habit of camp life had given these young conscripts strength and a military bearing they were far from having the previous July, but what especially raised their spirits was the knowledge that they were commanded by the Emperor in person, and the news of the arrival of the veteran corps of the Grande Armée. The Spaniards were seized with astonishment and fear at the sight of the old grenadiers of the true Grande Armée, and realized that the face of things was about to change. Indeed, scarcely had the Emperor arrived on the Ebro when he launched numerous columns across the river. Whatever dared to stand before them was exterminated, or owed its salvation only to rapid flight. However, the Spaniards, astonished but not discouraged, having gathered several of their corps under the walls of Burgos, dared to await battle. It took place on November 9th and was not long, for the enemy, broken at the first shock, fled in all directions, pursued by our cavalry, which inflicted immense losses on them. During this battle, something extraordinary, and fortunately very rare, occurred. 2 young second lieutenants of infantry from Marshal Lannes's command, having quarreled, fought a duel before the front of their battalion, under a hail of enemy cannonballs. One of them had his cheek split open by a saber blow. The colonel had them arrested and brought before the marshal, who sent them to the citadel of Burgos and reported the matter to the emperor. He increased the punishment by forbidding those officers to follow their company into combat for a month. When this period had expired, the regiment of these 2 hotheads was in Madrid, when the emperor, reviewing it, ordered the colonel to present to him, as was the custom, the names of those he proposed to replace fallen officers. The second lieutenant, who had had his cheek slashed, was an excellent soldier. His colonel did not think it right to deprive him of advancement for a fault which, though serious, was not dishonorable. He therefore proposed him to the emperor, who, seeing a fresh scar on the young man's face, recalled the duel at Burgos and sternly asked the officer, "Where did you receive that wound?" Then the second lieutenant, unwilling either to lie or to admit his fault, very cleverly turned the difficulty aside, for placing his finger on his cheek, he replied, "I received it here, sire." The emperor understood, and as he liked men of quick wit, far from being offended by this original reply, he smiled and said to the officer, "Your colonel proposes you for the rank of lieutenant. I grant it to you, but in future be wiser, or I shall break you." At Burgos I found my brother, who was serving in the campaign on the staff of Prince Berthier, the Major General. As Marshal Lannes' military talents grew daily, the Emperor, who had the highest opinion of him, no longer gave him a fixed command, wishing to reserve him near his person to send wherever affairs were compromised, certain he would promptly restore them. Thus, as Napoleon prepared to continue his march on Madrid, considering that he had left to his left the city of Saragossa, occupied by the insurgents of Aragon and supported by the army of Castaños, victorious over Dupont, and that the old Marshal Moncey was groping about, Napoleon ordered Marshal Lannes to proceed to Logroño, the center of the army of the Ebro, take command of it, and attack Castaños. Moncey thus found himself under the orders of Lannes. It was the first example of a marshal of the empire commanding his equal. Lannes deserved this mark of confidence and distinction. He set out with only his staff. We took post horses to avoid the delays that would have been caused by the transport of our baggage, and horses over a distance of 50 kilometers, and their return to Burgos and Madrid. Captain Dagoucin was charged with conducting them in the wake of Napoleon. You know that at that time, the Spanish posting stations had no draft horses, but they had the best bidets, small saddle horses, in Europe. The Marshal and we therefore set out at full gallop, escorted from post to post by detachments of cavalry. We retraced our way to Miranda del Ebro, whence we reached Logroño along the river. Marshal Monsi was in that town and seemed very displeased that the emperor placed him under the orders of the youngest of the marshals, he who was their senior, but he was obliged to obey. See what the presence of a single capable and energetic man can do. This army of conscripts, which Monsi had not dared to lead against the enemy, set in motion by Marshal Lannes on the very day of his arrival, marched with ardor against the enemy, whom we came up with the next day, the 23rd, in front of Tudela. After 3 hours of combat, the proud victors of Bailén were broken, beaten, routed, and fled in headlong haste toward Saragossa, leaving thousands of corpses on the battlefield. We took a great number of prisoners, several flags, and all the artillery. The victory was complete. In this affair, a bullet pierced my sabretache. At the beginning of the action, I had had a sharp altercation with Labédoyère. Here is why. He had just bought a horse, very young and little trained, which, at the first sound of cannon, reared up and absolutely refused to advance. Furious, Labédoyère leapt to the ground, drew his sabre, and cut the hamstrings of the unfortunate animal, which fell bleeding onto the grass, where it crawled, dragging itself in agony. I could not restrain my indignation, and expressed it to him strongly. But Labédoyère took it very ill, and we would have come to blows had we not been in the presence of the enemy. The story having spread through the staff, Marshal Lannes, indignant, declared that Labédoyère would no longer be counted among his aides-de-camp. Desperate, the latter was already seizing his pistols to blow out his brains, when our friend de Viry made him understand that it would be more honorable to go seek death in the enemy's ranks. Just then, de Viry, who had approached the marshal, received the order to lead a regiment of cavalry against a Spanish battery. Labédoyère joined the regiment that was charging, and hurled himself among the first upon the battery, which was taken, and we saw de Viry and Labédoyère bringing back a cannon they had captured together. Neither of them was wounded, but the latter had received a musket ball in his bearskin cap, 2 fingers from his head. The marshal was all the more moved by the act of courage Labédoyère had just accomplished, as the latter, after handing him the cannon, was preparing to hurl himself again upon the enemy bayonets. The marshal restrained him, and, pardoning his fault, restored him to his place on his staff. That very evening, Labédoyère came nobly to shake my hand, and we lived afterward in good understanding. Labédoyère and de Viry were mentioned in the battle bulletin and promoted to captains some time later. That concludes the 6th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.